Welcome back to the PolicyViz podcast. I'm your host, John Schwabish, and welcome to the final episode of Season 8 of the podcast. I am very excited to work into my summer break from the podcast. Don't worry, I'll be back in the fall with more episodes, but I'm excited to wrap up this season. It's been a long one. It's been a hard one. A lot of stuff going on, so I am pleased to get through it. I hope you've enjoyed all the different episodes, learned a lot about data visualization and presentation skills and data communication. So I'm going to get right to this final episode with Danielle Alberti, the graphics editor at Axios. I hope you've been watching Axios' work. They have been doing amazing stuff, and they've been growing tremendously. As you'll hear in the interview, we talk about the growth of the team, the changes in the tools, their approach to different types of content, how they write around their visualizations, which I found shocking, really, to say the least. Like the amount of words that they don't write is pretty amazing. And we also talk about Danielle's approach or thinking on how to communicate large numbers, which has been an important consideration in the last few months as we neared and passed the mark of 1 million deaths from COVID here in the United States. So I'm going to move you on to the interview with Danielle, and here is that conversation. Hi, Danielle. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you
I'm
doing?
doing great. Thanks so much for coming on the show. Very, very excited. Not only because I'm excited learning more about the Axios visuals team, but also because just a big fan of all of your craftiness on the Twitter. And, getting your daughter's little reading nook together. And what are you crocheting now? Is that what I've seen?
Cross-stitching.
How's that going?
I just finished my first piece in a few years. I did it a lot as a kid, but picking it up again as an adult.
Nice. Getting a little of that non-screen time?
Yeah, that's kind of the goal. I started sewing a couple months ago too, bought a sewing machine in February and just immediately started sewing clothes for me and my daughter. And just kind of trying to pick up a few things to get away from the screen every once in a while.
Yeah, I started umpiring at the Little League because I was like, I need to not be on this, because it's just, I mean, you probably know this too. Here's my office, and 5 feet away is the house, and it's like the siren call of the computer all the time, and outside for a little bit just breaks the spell.
And I feel like, especially as a person who's working in news, I feel like I really just have this need to be attached to the news all the time. And it's so difficult to break away from that.
And it's so depressing now. So there's that whole
and it's constantly depressing and it's horrible. And you still feel like this obligation that you have to be there and witnessing it. And sometimes it's helpful to have something to just kind of force you to get away.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so Axios. So I have been watching from afar, obviously, the changes, evolution. You're always seem to be hiring these days for more people. So what does the team look like right now?
Yeah, well, let's see. When I started about 2.5 years ago, it was me managing 2 other people. As of right now, I'm managing a team of 9 other people. So data visualization is 10, and then our illustration team is 10.
Oh, wow.
And we work very closely together, which is why I mention them, that we all kind of coexist in the same Slack room, and we edit each other's work and help each other with ideas and frequently collaborate on projects. So, we've gone from a very, very tiny team to something that has just become this Axios visuals army.
Right.
So it does seem like we're kind of hiring a lot. We, as local has been expanding, we launched in 2 new cities today. We had to keep hiring visuals people to keep up with that. We initially started out with this formula of, how many newsletters do we need to launch per new hire, or vice versa, I guess, how many new hires per
newsletter,
for extra newsletters. But I hired several engineering types last year who have increased a lot of the speed and batching capabilities of a lot of the charts that we're trying to make. And so it's made it so that we aren't growing quite as fast as we were
I
last year.
gotcha. I gotcha. So
Um, so yeah, just all a very roundabout way of saying yes, we have been growing rapidly, but we're slowing down a little bit in this next year or
okay.
so.
So how has as the head, as that lead editor of the graphics team, how has your
Mm-hmm.
job changed, or maybe better put, like, has the process changed by which all this content sort of funnels and goes out the
Oh
door?
gosh, like so it's completely
Oh,
unrecognizable
yeah.
from when I started. When I first started, we like I said, there were three of us, and we basically had an in-house chart builder tool, and we had Illustrator, and we had D3.
Okay.
And most of what we were making was being made in this chart builder tool and Illustrator. Today, we use Data Wrapper for most of our quick turnaround stuff, and we're using Svelte for a lot of our more customized things. But then we also have tons and tons of templates and tools that we're using to really speed up the
Mm-hmm.
process. So a lot of our sports graphics, they're just templates where we're pulling it up in the console, typing a couple of lines, and it's spinning up this standings table or something like
And that's
that.
in the internal tool that the templates are built
Yeah,
in. Okay. Yeah.
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 Um, and we have a couple of other internal tools for building stock
Mm-hmm.
charts, other kind of finance charts, and then we have just a few other templates that require a little bit more finessing, like maps and stuff
Right.
that require a bit more actual work, but are still really really increasing the speed that we're able to do that stuff at.
Yeah.
So we're using Illustrator a lot less, and we have a lot more power over what we're actually doing.
Right.
So, yeah, that process has changed just
Yeah, I
phenomenally.
bet.
Um, and whereas before it was our tiny team of three just had to rush, 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 rush to get everything out the door. We were constantly bombarded, just trying to survive. Now that we're at like this team of 10 and we're more efficient and we're kind of working faster, we have a lot more time that we can focus on building new tools and really kind of working more on the long-term stories and finding our own stories and doing a lot of the fun stuff that we always wanted to do.
Yeah. So I want to ask you about that, but before we go on to that. So
Uh-huh.
in this previous iteration, it was D3 and Illustrator and this internal tool. Do you
Yeah.
find now, with the changes in the tools and using Data Wrapper now, do you find that you've moved a little bit more towards interactive graphics, whereas before maybe it was more static images?
The vast bulk of what we're making is still going to be
Yeah.
static. Most of what we're doing is static or like data wrapper
Right.
interactive,
Like a
like
tooltip or something. Yeah.
a little
Yeah.
tooltip. Um, that's the vast majority of what we're doing. It's super quick turnaround. It's usually going to run for the newsletter the next day. That's
Mhm.
it. But we have a lot more time now that we're able to devote to things that require a little bit more
Mhm.
creativity, some more investigation, a lot more time. It's really freed us up that we can chase our own
Yeah.
stories.
So that's really what I wanted to spend some time talking about, because Axios clearly is a different animal than like a New York Times or a Post, because they seem to be a lot shorter, quick hit newsletter type pieces, as opposed to like the big dive deep. And
Mhm.
I'm curious. We can talk about the evolution in a minute, but I'm curious, from a data visualization visuals perspective, do you like the, like, numerous more shorter hit things rather than the deep dive pieces that maybe take a few months to do?
So
Now, both personally and maybe as a team, I think.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, I would kind of push back on the idea that it has to be That being something that's really painstaking, takes a lot of time, takes a lot of creativity, is necessarily a deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
At Axios, our thing is smart brevity. We're trying to get people to learn as much as they can in as short a time as they really
Mm-hmm.
can. Um, and we're really extending that to our storytelling team, where we want our longer form graphics to still be fairly brief, fairly
Mm-hmm.
concise, low word count, but tell a big story in a short amount of time.
Mm.
And frequently that means that we're spending a lot of time working on that, conceiving of it, designing it, editing it. Um, but the reader may only take a couple of minutes to actually digest
Yeah.
it. In our COVID million deaths project, um, we worked on that a while, uh, but ultimately the word count is probably under 100.
Yeah.
Um, there's almost no words
Right.
there. It's completely a visual
Yeah.
product, and so that's something that we really try to push when we're doing our more immersive storytelling, is that we want it to still be very concise.
So how does that force you to think? I mean, that must force you to think really differently. Like,
It
right? Like,
does.
so can you talk a little bit about that? Because I imagine, for a lot of pieces, it's, even if it's just an exploratory map, there's a lot of words wrapping around that. It explains the data and
Right.
explains this and that. But yeah, like you said, like 100 words is like that's like nothing.
I think that in data visualization, especially outside of journalism, but also frequently inside of journalism, a lot of people um, have trouble editing down what they have.
Mm-hmm.
They think that if I have all of this data, I need to show all of this
Mm-hmm.
data, and it's such a difficult skill to pinch that down into what is the story that you actually want to
Mm-hmm.
tell. Um, I think for us, that's something that we focus on really heavily, is what is the story exactly that we're trying to tell? What is the exact angle that our writer is trying to get
Mm-hmm.
across? What is the most interesting piece of this data? What is the thing that the reader needs to understand to come away from this story with, like, an
Yeah. Yeah.
understanding?
Right. Yeah.
um and that's a skill that we really have to hone in on a lot. you know I definitely see it a lot as people join my team, that it takes a little bit for them to kind of figure out, how do we nail down exactly the right
Yeah.
pieces of data to get the information across to the reader, um, without including a bunch of extra
Right.
stuff. So that's just kind of a skill that really needs to be developed. And yeah, it's definitely something that requires a lot of attention and
Yeah.
forethought. I'm coming from Pew Research Center, um, where giving everybody
Everything.
everything it's generally the
Right.
preference. You you want it to be a data dump. You want people to explore everything, have everything. That's fantastic, like, a lot of the
Yeah.
time. With our election project today, that we launched today, that's a data exploration project, and we want people to be able to explore that. We want people to be able to look at different issues and different county, or not counties,
Mm-hmm.
districts, compare the district that they know to the neighboring district that their aunt lives in, and see what kind of deductions they're coming up with. But the vast majority of our work is not going to be the data exploration kind of work. It's going to be the storytelling kind of
Right.
work. This is what you need to know. And that's a difficult skill to
Yeah,
master.
I mean, it seems like, now the way you talk about it, it seems like in a lot of ways the words uh get us off the hook a little bit, right? Because we can like
Mhm.
have the graph and then say a whole bunch of other stuff off to the side that we don't actually visualize, and it gets us around a lot of this editing requirement.
Hmm.
Um, do you find that, a reporter brings the story and they have, X number of things that they want to talk about and you help winnow them down? Do you find that in that winnowing process, you're like, hey, those three other things actually were pretty interesting, but we're just going to do them as separate stories? And then does it like come back as like a repeat, not a repeating thing, but like, four little pieces instead of like one traditional longer
That
piece?
definitely, yeah, that definitely happens sometimes, as well as vice versa,
Mm,
honestly. I think that's one of those things that goes both ways. I think one of the things that's really nice about our newsroom is that we're really empowered from the very top to, like, we are journalists, we're reporters, we're data journalists, and we are able to tell reporters that we work with whether this is good data or not.
hmm.
It is, does this data match the story that you're trying to tell? What does this actually mean? Should we be talking about this? And we have that that power to be able to work with them. So rather than just being a service desk, we're
Yeah.
collaborators. And so that is something that frequently happens, is that we'll be talking to these reporters, and sometimes it is, I saw this other really interesting thing in the data that we should probably either be including in this story or we should be writing another story
Yeah.
about. Like, can we follow up on this? And conversely, a lot of the time reporters have the same, if I have the data, I must use the data
Yeah.
impulse that everybody has. And frequently we have to be like, look, I can't put 12 lines on this
Right.
chart. I'm
Right.
not, if we put 12 lines on this line chart, it's not going to help anybody. We need to figure this out. What can we actually
Mm,
trim, and work with them to figure out what can we take off of this to really, or should we consolidate
hmm.
things? How can we make this work more for the
Yeah.
reader? So we definitely go both directions with, when we work with our
Yeah.
reporters.
So does every reporter, the visuals for every news story, do they all come through your desk, or are the reporters able to use that in-house tool to build like a bar chart, in Data Wrapper, for example?
Yeah, so our reporters are the primary users of that in-house tool
Okay.
now. It's called Hermes. It does line charts, bar charts, and heat tables. So the reporters use that, um, but it all has to go past my desk basically for edits. We need to make sure that it's following our house
Hmm.
style, that the data is accurate. We have to do our number
Hmm.
checks. We make sure that all of our charts are edited to the exact same standards that anything else
Gotcha.
would be.
Gotcha.
So yeah, they may build it
Right.
themselves,
But
but
it's going
it's
through
still
you
going
guys.
past
Okay.
us.
All right.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the piece that you all did on marking the milestone of 1 million deaths in the U.S. from COVID. Um,
Right.
Definitely, I think kind of a different piece from your team, both in terms of its kind of size. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but like size on the web, I guess. But I'm curious, and for folks who haven't seen it, and I'll put a link to it. It was sort of these ever growing squares as you sort of scroll down over the course of the pandemic. I guess generally, and on the last episode of the show, I talked to Aliza from the New York Times about their stories about the same milestone. I'm just curious about how you and your team think about communicating these really large, important numbers.
I think um I think it's impossible for a person to understand what a million means. People aren't capable of actually thinking in that quantity. You understand a person's death. You understand 10 people's deaths, but at a million, that's just not something that people can
Yeah.
understand. And we wanted to provide some context for, okay, you may not understand what several 100,000 people would be, but maybe you've been to Nashville. you know what would it look like if just Nashville ceased to
Mm-hmm.
exist. And then so many of the events that we included are events that you grew up in American public schools learning as like some of the
Yeah.
most
Right.
disastrous things that have
Yeah.
happened in US history. And when you compare these numbers against wars, they dwarf
Right.
them. Um, so we wanted to add that kind of scale. And, clearly there was, as is always the case in data visualization, there's a lot of conversation about how trying to trying to represent a million people with just abstract shapes on a page isn't enough, and it's true. It's not
Yeah.
enough.
Right. Right.
Um, but it is something that can provide a little bit of context to just what is the sheer magnitude of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that bothers me a little bit about that whole sentiment that, if we use any shape, bars or squares, whatever,
Right.
that we can't get people to really feel the impact of a million deaths or a million whatever it is, a million big things. And I think that argument in a lot of ways sort of misses the point that that's not really what these pieces are about. It's about putting
Right.
in context, not necessarily making you feel at like a visceral,
Yeah.
heartbroken level.
Right. I think that there is a place for the kinds of stories that are talking about the individual
Mm-hmm.
victims and you know this person with their family and this person with their hopes and dreams and this person's photo, and you can do individual portraits of people, and that's clearly going to absolutely break your heart. But then you can also there's also a place for showing, like, okay, so we've seen this is a portrait of 5 people. Those 5 people are this little
Right.
tiny blip in this massive block
Right.
of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of more people who are exactly like
Yeah.
that. So showing that kind of scale is something that you can absolutely provide in addition to the microcosm
Mm-hmm.
of who these people
Yeah.
were.
Yeah. Um, so
There's a lot of space on the internet. We can do all of
right,
it,
right, right.
honestly. No data visualization, no journalistic project has to be everything for everyone, and that's something that we have to talk about a
Yeah,
lot.
I think
It's
that's right. And I think it's often like more of a body of work to look at rather than each
right.
kind of individual piece. I mean, I look at some of the folks on your team, like, Will Chase and I are, Will's been on the show and like,
Hmm.
um, you know, I go through his work and it's sort of like, you kind of see this body of work and, sometimes he's playing around, right? Like he's playing with the illustrations and now I know there's a design team. So he's clearly like working with them. So,
Hmm.
yeah, I think oftentimes maybe we in the data viz field pick a project from an organization that's putting out a lot of stuff and pick it apart and not see this over sort of this larger narrative that they're pulling together.
And I mean, you see that all the time with journalism in general. Like, why are you covering this story when there's also this other story that's more important? Well, we're covering that story
Right. We can
too.
do both.
We're covering both
Right.
stories. And so yeah, that's definitely something that data viz is subject to. Is yeah, we can do million COVID deaths. We can do midterm election or midterm Google trends. We can also do hot dog prices in
Yeah.
Detroit. These are all things that we can do. Um, I think it's one thing that I think is kind of important to note is that data in data journalism in general, um, we've had a rough 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
It it has been a lot of counting deaths, and every day it's putting out more charts of
Yeah.
horrible things. It's been a really rough couple of years for data
Yeah.
journalists. And so in addition to all of that work, I definitely like it when my team can kind of branch out into the silly,
Mm-hmm.
branch out into the more abstract, and do something that they can actually have fun
Yeah.
with, because they need a
Right.
break.
Right.
They they need a break from the misery.
Yeah. Okay, so then let's pivot away from the misery a little bit, although maybe depending on your view. I want to talk about the new election project.
Hmm.
Um, so this is and I'll again put the link on the show notes so people can check it out. But it's a collaboration between you all and the Google News Lab and Alberto Cairo. Is that right?
Uh,
Or
yeah.
yeah, okay.
Yep.
And so this seems to be sort of a different type of piece for your team. It's more of a
Hmm.
big exploratory piece. So can you just talk about it a little bit?
Yeah. Um, so we've been working with Google Trends for, I don't know, probably about a year on a few different projects. No, actually, we've been working with Google Trends for several years. We put out every year. We put out the year in news
Right.
spark line
Right.
that always gets a lot of attention. And that one's fantastic. And so, spinning off of that partnership that we have with them, we've done several different projects with them, and this is definitely the most ambitious so far.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, we wanted to visualize what are the trends that are really going to, what are the issues that are really going to matter in November. What are people really focusing on? Um, but we also wanted to make sure that we're kind of tracking it in real
Hmm.
time. We've been collecting this data, I want to say since around
Oh,
Christmas.
okay.
And so we're collecting this to see what the actual trend lines look like throughout this entire process. We'll be updating it, I believe, weekly, to just show how things are changing as we get closer to the
Yeah.
elections. So you'll see that we released it today. The data is from last week. I think ending last Monday.
Yeah. The 24th, I think, is what I saw.
So you'll certainly see that, like, gun control is not quite as high up as it will probably be in our next
Right.
update. Um, but because of that, we're getting these snapshots in time of what are people talking about, what is at top of mind right
Hmm.
now. I think what's really interesting about it is seeing, there's a barcode element that I think is just really fantastic, and being able to see what is the overall distribution across all of the districts, but then selecting, whichever district you want to focus on, your district, and seeing where it falls in the barcode,
Hmm.
I think is just a really cool
Yeah.
feature, to see just, what matters to
Yeah.
us.
It is interesting. I feel like I have seen more uh, maps being combined with some sort of distributional element, so that it's if it's
Mhm.
this one's congressional districts, so you've got I don't know how many districts there are. There's 3,000 zip codes or whatever it is. So all these lines. But I've seen other ones where it's like there's a little bar chart above the top. I use a thing where I put like convert the legend into a bar chart, just getting that distributional piece because you look at this map and you're like, I mean, the classic, right? It's the presidential election. Like, yeah, Wyoming's all red, but
Yeah,
like, I don't know how to like see the distribution.
naturally.
The other piece that I really like about it, and I tend to like once I play around with it, then I look at like the small things. Is you all inserted this little information tooltip thing that tells the reader what a cartogram is because you got like the core. So people haven't seen it. It's like it's a choropleth map by congressional district, and there's just a little button you can click, and it will toggle over to a cartogram, and so it all sort of animates into these little boxes around the thing, and there's just like this little perfect explainer of like what a cartogram is. Um, yeah.
So, so the origin for that, um, anyone who follows me on Twitter has probably seen me um, explaining cartograms to readers who not so kindly ask me if I know where Louisiana is. Um, every time, every time we use a cartogram, um, we end up getting comments of like, Axios, they're so stupid. Why don't they know where Iowa is?
Right.
And I'm just like, I, I'm I'm in my 30s. I'm a data viz professional.
Right.
I've seen Arkansas. Like this is not. So I always have to explain. What is the purpose of a cartogram? The purpose of a cartogram being that it's a map form where you distort the map in this case to show different geographic areas with the same um, size and shape so that larger geographic areas don't get more emphasis than smaller
Yeah.
ones. Basically, that Texas should not be more important than Rhode Island in certain
Right.
cases. So I always explain that to people on Twitter, and most of the time they come back and they're like, oh wow, I didn't actually get that, thanks for explaining that. And so my team kind of jokes that like it's my personal, like it's my personal mission to just like teach people what cartograms were. So I really loved that when they built this. And kudos to Le Monde because we definitely
Yeah.
heavily we were heavily inspired by them for the way that Will built out the cartogram showing the boxes inside of the
States.
state
Yeah.
shapes. Um, and Jackie wanted to include an explanation of what a cartogram
Yeah.
was. They were worried that if they just put that word there, people weren't going to bother clicking on it because they don't know what it is. And so they wanted to explain what it
Yeah.
was. And so I'm pretty sure that she almost word for word ripped off one of my Twitter
Right.
rants. And so that ended up making
Hey,
it
there
in
you go.
there.
So Twitter is good for something.
It's not, but it's not at all.
Yeah, that's right. That it did. It did remind me of that Le Monde cartogram from the election.
Yep.
It's the choropleth. It's the map with the squares inside. Oh, that's pretty great.
I completely adored
Yeah.
that cartogram. I thought it was just so beautifully done, and so yeah, we were heavily inspired by that.
So I'm curious, and I won't keep you all day, but I'm curious because the way I talk about that Le Monde map, and for those who haven't
Mm-hmm.
seen it, it's the outline of the United States with all the states outlined, and then it has little squares in each state for the number of electoral votes. Um, the way I talk about that map is, oh, if I think about the average Le Monde reader in France, probably doesn't know the details of all the states in the U.S. and electoral votes. So it makes sense that you'd give them the geography and these sort of little unit charts on top of it. I'm curious though, for your readers, like why did you include the toggle between the two?
Um, because
Just to get at that
tech.
cartogram, like
No. I mean, Texas or Wyoming.
yeah,
Wyoming is why.
right, yeah, right,
It's
yeah, okay, yeah,
Wyoming is one congressional
yeah,
district, and my own congressional district in Arlington, Virginia, is impossible to actually
yeah.
find on a geographic
Yeah.
map. Wyoming is one
One
congressional
district.
district.
Yeah.
Um, it's really important, I think, to balance those by showing that you know my congressional district, even if you can't find it on a map, has more people than the state of Wyoming does, and you should be able to find both of those districts with equal ease on this kind of
Yeah.
map. And then putting those little squares inside of the geographic states, I think makes it a really fantastic bucket.
Mm.
Um, I think that congressional cartograms are typically lots of little squares or hexagons that are roughly in the shape of their original state, but they're all kind of grouped together in a way where they're very blobby.
Yes.
And I think that the way that Le Monde and now Axios has put them into their geographic states. They're tiny little
Yeah.
buckets that really help it stay
Yeah.
organized.
I like that. States as little tiny buckets.
Yeah.
This is great. Danielle, thanks so much for coming on the show. I'm really excited to see what you guys come up with next. I love all your work, and yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks so much.
So good to talk to you. Thanks.
And thanks everyone for tuning into this week's episode of the show. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed this entire season as much as I did. This is wrapping up season 8 of the show. As I tell people, everyone has a podcast, but I've been doing it for a while. If you would like to support the show, please consider sharing it on your networks with your favorite podcast provider. Check out my offerings on Patreon, or if you'd like to get some mobile data viz right to your phone, check out my Winnow app. 2 to 3 times a week, I send out a little text with a new visualization, a new technique. I've got some giveaways going on with some books that I'm just trying to clean out of my office. As you can see behind me, if you're watching the video, I've got a lot of books in my office, trying to clean some of them out. So anyway, this is the last episode of the season. I want to thank all the folks who help me out every time an episode comes up. Ken Skaggs, Sharon Satsky Ramirez, the folks who transcribe the show, and everyone else who has joined me and taken time out of their day to talk to me about their work. I really do appreciate it, and I hope you and your family and your friends have a safe and happy and healthy summer, and I will see you in the fall. So until next time, this has been the PolicyViz podcast. Thanks so much for listening.